On the Buzz Meter this Sunday, a divisive media debate in the aftermath of the Las Vegas massacre over President Trump's response, over gun control, over whether the tragedy itself is being politicized.
It was an act of pure evil. And though we feel such great anger at the senseless murder of our fellow citizens, it is our love that defines us today and always will. Forever.
Saying as part of his remarks, our unity cannot be shattered by evil. Look, pitch perfect from the president right there.
I thought the president's statement today was just so emotional and that the tone was exactly right, that it was both unifying and comforting for the country.
The president, many Republicans want to put off a discussion on gun laws, obviously, put off permanently. They argue now's not the time, though there never will be a time.
So more guns doesn't equal more death. But still, the media focuses on the gun, especially early on, before all is known.
Every incident like this, and we've heard it again today, now is not the time to talk about how to deal with gun violence. Now is not the time. Think about that. Why is now not the time?
None of this mattered to the left in this country. Their impulse to politicize this tragedy, as they do other tragedies, is beyond the pale. They are using this tragedy, why? To score cheap political points and push a gun control agenda.
Are news organizations fueling the polarization? And have they been fair or unduly negative about the Trump visit to devastated Puerto Rico? Jimmy Kimmel and other late-night comics speak out about Las Vegas, ripping Republicans and calling for gun control.
You want to make America great again? Do something the last two presidents haven't been able to do. Pass any kind of common sense gun control legislation that the vast majority of Americans want.
Are they changing their role from entertainers to partisan activists? Plus, the New York Times reveals that media mogul Harvey Weinstein has faced sexual harassment allegations over 3 decades, including one from Ashley Judd, and has reached at least 8 legal settlements with women.
How could Harvey Weinstein enjoy all of this public acclaim, collect all these Oscars over the years, while in the background, in private, these allegations are piling up? So settlements are part of the answer, because the women who have these stories, in many cases, were not allowed to speak publicly about them.
Now the big Democratic donor is accusing the Times of reckless reporting, but is also taking a leave of absence. Does he have a case? I'm Howard Kurtz, and this is MediaBuzz. Even in an age of mass shootings, the massacre conducted from a high-rise Vegas hotel has truly shocked and horrified the country and touched off a polarizing debate about guns and violence and politics across the media landscape. The president offered encouraging words during his visit.
This tremendous bravery. The police department, incredible. The people themselves, incredible. People leaving ambulances to have somebody else go because they thought they were hurt, even more so.
Joining us now to analyze the coverage, Shannon Pettypiece, White House correspondent for Bloomberg News. Molly Hemingway, senior editor at The Federalist and a Fox News contributor. And Marie Harf, a Fox News contributor and former spokeswoman for the Obama administration. Shannon, journalists like everybody else, stunned and appalled by the carnage in Las Vegas, and we have been through this so many times. Do you think there's a sense of weariness and frustration, therefore, that comes through in the coverage?
I think so. I think there's also a sense of we in newsrooms have been through this so many times that it's almost like a drill. Here we go again. Okay, another story, another mass shooting. It's almost, I wouldn't say it's gotten routine, but we do feel like it's a drill where we're seeing it again and kind of saying to ourselves, how has this become part of our jobs?
Right. How has it become such a, unfortunately, a tragically recurring part of the culture? And Molly, you know, with Hillary Clinton and other Democrats quickly, after we all learned about this, tweeting appeals for gun control, there's been a debate over the media debate. I mean, I got beat up online for saying, could we just wait until tomorrow morning because the bodies are still in the streets? But in our culture, nobody waits.
Right. I think it's interesting to call it a drill because it almost does seem like this type of ritual that people go through. They immediately go not to any of the number of things you could go to whenever there's a mass shooting, but to gun control. And that's a problem not just because the media, most people in the media you can sense are sort of reflexively anti-gun and pro-gun control, which is improper because you don't want to see people pushing an agenda. But particularly problematic with guns and gun control is that we have a media that are very bad at just knowing the basic facts. I mean, you had CNN put out an illustration generation of bump fire stock where they had a gun animation, it had a grenade launcher, it had a silencer, it didn't have a bump fire stock. And there are all sorts of just basic errors that make it hard if you are a gun owner or if you know anything about guns to take them seriously because they don't know what they're talking about.
Well, it's an important debate, and it's observation I made was purely about the timing. But if President Trump had given a speech the next day and said, this shows we should loosen gun laws so people can better protect themselves, he would have been a savage for politicizing a tragedy.
Well, I don't think it's fair to say that everyone who calls for, looking at how we can prevent this from happening in the future is just plain politics. Some of these are legitimate policy issues, and as a country, I think we should come together on both sides of the aisle and say, why does this keep happening, and how do we prevent it, not just from the gun side, from the mental health side, from all of the sides. And I don't think it's fair to say the media is anti-gun. I think the media, as Americans, are anti-people getting shot and killed at a rate in this country that happens nowhere else in the developed world. And in the wake of these tragedies, I think it's human nature to say, how can we prevent this from happening again? We do it with terrorist attacks, right? When terrorists use planes to fly into buildings, we say, should we have tougher regulations on airline security? Why is this any different? I don't think it should be.
Briefly respond?
Well, I think the problem is that there's not an actual conversation happening about guns. It's just sort of a monologue, a lecture, where if you don't believe in restricting the Second Amendment, which is, a pretty foundational thing to our country, we assume a right to defend ourselves against tyranny in the Declaration of Independence. We protect the right to self-defense in the Second Amendment. And to sort of just go right over that and into this reflexive demand for gun control, which, contrary to some of what we heard in the opening, is actually not the viewpoint of most Americans. I mean, you see, this is again a ritual that the media partake in. They push this, and they don't actually listen to people or even understand arguments against gun control.
Let me get specific, because the New York Times and the Washington Post, Shannon, said in the aftermath that Republicans in Congress might actually support some narrowly tailored measures, particularly involving these bump stocks, these so-called $200 devices that can make a semi-automatic weapon fire more like an automatic weapon, which is illegal. Then the NRA came out and said, yes, we would be supportive of additional regulation on these devices. Is the coverage reflecting a changing climate on the question of guns?
Well, I think this is the first time we've seen some agreement between the two sides on something, at least something. To Molly's point about not really a conversation going on, I feel like I'm really seeing that happening in this maybe even more than some of these past tragedies. The bump stock issue is interesting because I have not done an enormous amount of reporting on gun control issues. That hasn't really been a focus of my reporting. But I had known that there were ways to modify a semi-automatic weapon to make it automatic. And to hear all these lawmakers come out and say, oh, I had never heard of a bump stock, or I didn't know this was something that could be done, it made me say, well, how much are we listening to each other? How much conversation is going on about what the issues are, and maybe we all need to be listening to each other some more.
Again. Yeah. Bump fire stock actually doesn't convert a semi-automatic into an automatic. There are ways that you can convert a semi-automatic into an automatic. What bump fire is just a method of firing, and there are all sorts of ways you can do it. It doesn't actually, it simulates automatic fire, but it's not automatic fire. And that's actually important because that's why it's legal. I mean, it is sort of it's an important semantic difference. And people, you can actually do bump firing using your thumb and a belt loop. There are all sorts of ways you can do it. So changing the classification of these stocks is not going to prevent the actual problem. And that's I just think this is why the media need to bring in some consultants who know about guns. They need to maybe have people go out and learn how to do guns.
I think they have been this week. And I know the argument always is bad people will do bad things no matter what. Let's make it harder for bad people to do bad things. And I want that conversation, Molly. I've been calling for that all week. I think sometimes it's frustrating that on the right, people who support the Second Amendment make it seem like it's unfettered access to any weapon, anytime, anywhere, and shut down the conversation when you say maybe he shouldn't have been able to buy 40 guns.
See, that's
not written into the Second Amendment that you can buy any weapon at any time with any magazine clip size anywhere for any person, period.
No, just the point being,
it's not.
You take something that people actually might agree on, such as reclassifying these bump fire stocks, and then you move it to how many guns you can buy. So people understandably get worried when people start calling for gun control, particularly, again, when we're not talking about anything else related to this shooting.
Well,
we don't know all the facts.
Of it in the wake
do
of
need to point out that in this particular case, the calls, for example, for tighter background checks would not have worked because the Las Vegas shooter didn't have a criminal record. So we have that. All right, let me move on now because this debate is going to go on for a long time, and it should. Let me move on now to the president tweeting. This was after the two leaders of the Senate Intelligence Committee held a televised briefing on the progress of their investigation into possible Russian collusion. President, why isn't the Senate Intel Committee looking into the fake news networks in our country to see why so much of our news is just made up? Fake. President seemed to almost be calling for a Senate investigation of the press.
Well, I guess that was the way it was interpreted. The issue around fake news, well, it's sort of this issue around fake news, which we saw in really a bipartisan way, that we saw the Senate Intelligence Committee, both members coming out and agreeing that there is an issue with fake news being a troll farm in Ukraine or Russia producing just made-up articles.
But the president means inaccurate news when he says fake news.
So he's conflating the two, and the danger with doing that is that maybe these fake news stories coming out of a fake news farm in Russia aren't hurting you right now, but at some point, maybe 3 years down the road, there are going to be blatantly fake stories about you murdered someone 16 years ago, or you're running a pedophile ring out of a pizza shop about you, and then you're really going to need to and want to go against these fake news farms. So that's the danger here of forgetting the Russian troll farms.
Whatever the many flaws of the media, we have spent a lot of time examining them, the government should look into the media's conduct?
Well, I made a joke when he tweeted that the First Amendment was what was keeping an investigation from happening. But you make a good point. They already are investigating media companies. So he's saying, why not investigate these other companies? I think it's funny you say, what if bad stories came out that were unfair to Donald Trump or inaccurate? I think he's been experiencing that for quite some time. And I think that's his point that he's trying to make, that there is so much hostile media coverage. There was that recent, the Pew study that just came out showing 62% of stories in the first 100 days were negative compared to 20% for Obama. I mean, this is the type of,
and 5% positive towards
and they're breaking norms left and right, and I think he wants to just draw attention.
Well, Sarah, let me just jump in, because Sarah Huckabee Sanders didn't sort of embrace the notion that the media would be investigated, but also we'll talk about in the next segment, the NBC report on Rex Tillerson, Secretary of State, may also have animated the president in regard to this tweet.
Right. He uses the term fake news when there are stories he doesn't like, whether or not they're true. And I have a number of people telling me that Rex Tillerson absolutely called the president a moron.
And Rex Tillerson and his spokesperson are not two of those people. They have denied this, the underlying story.
Let me finish here for a second. Rex actually didn't deny it, and he had the chance to on the record. But the problem here is
he specifically said he wouldn't address it because it's such petty gossip.
If that was my boss, I would have said deny it,
and
he would have.
She did come out and deny it.
So the problem is, the Senate Intel Committee is not looking into real news organizations. They are looking into exactly, as other folks have said, these fake news places in Macedonia, troll farms that had a serious impact on how people were seeing things.
And if the Senate Committee finds that there's been inaccurate reporting on the Russia probe, the committee should criticize. All right, MediaBuzz at foxnews.com. If you want to write to us, ahead the New York Times documenting sexual harassment allegations against Hollywood producer Harvey Weinstein, but he rips the paper's reporting. And when we come back, the president takes a media battering over his visit to Puerto Rico. After days of being battered by the media over Puerto Rico, the president went to the devastated island this week and drew lots of flack from his detractors in the press.
You've thrown our budget a little out of whack because we've spent a lot of money on Puerto Rico, and that's fine. We've saved a lot of lives.
I think it was a great visit. The joke, I think he gives the enemies a little bit of ammunition.
It was bizarre behavior. It was celebratory when this is an island that's struggling.
To me, it's almost like we've lost our sense of what is purely outrageous coming from this president anymore. That is just a strange and unpresidential thing to do, to be throwing rolls of paper towels at people.
Strange and unpresidential. And Molly Hemingway, one might say the president had a few awkward moments in Puerto Rico, but much of the media hammered him as if he's just an utterly insensitive human being.
Actually, it's almost seemed like an alternate reality that many people in the media were living in. You know, you watch the actual crowds. Everyone seems eager to see him. They're laughing at his jokes, which, you know, most people understand how Donald Trump jokes. You get back to seeing how people in the newsrooms are, and they act uniformly hostile, like it was this horrible visit. And it was very weird. You know, as Matthew Continetti said, who do you believe? The people who thought Hillary Clinton had it in the bag, or your own lying eyes? I mean, that was a successful.
How long are we going to keep using that one?
Well, there was already a media narrative, and this is fair to debate, whether the administration was slow to mobilize the military on Puerto Rico, slow to make it a major issue, but it almost seemed like the press was primed to write negative stories on that visit.
Well, I don't think it's biased to say that President Trump has a different style than his predecessors, and I think actually his supporters like him for that.
That's not what we heard.
Right, so
that's and unpresidential and
that's
terrible.
Where I'm not agreeing with everything that you just showed.
Sure.
But one of the jobs of the media is to fact check what people in any administration say, and I think what some of them were trying to get at was the celebratory tone of the president's visit compared with the fact that upwards of 80 to 90% of the folks on the island still didn't have power. He was striking a tone that to a lot of people in Puerto Rico, not to media folks, but to people in Puerto Rico, felt a little bit at odds. I don't think that's bias to point some of that out, and I think it's a fine line.
It's a fine line because you want to deliver hope, and at the same time you don't want to underplay the situation. Now, being able to comfort people after a major tragedy or natural disaster, that's part of the job of being president, but doesn't a lot of this amount to theater criticism? Well, we don't like the way he did it.
Even people who like this president are supporters of him, allies of him, they will say he's not the most articulate messenger always. And I mean, to your point as well, but his base still likes him. They don't mind that about him.
He hasn't been a professional politician who was accustomed to working crowds and giving speeches in this kind of situations.
He's going to do it his way. He has his own style. He has not changed from the campaign that style. He is staying true to who he is. Maybe some people thought there would be a pivot, there would be a change in how he would handle these disaster type situations, but I think it's staying pretty true to who he has shown he has been, and like it or don't.
I think what happened is the media tried to Katrina him, and they failed, and they were angry. And so when he had a visit and it went well, and you know, this is a horrible disaster that's happening, but the U.S. efforts at repair and recovery and relief are going pretty well, given all the bad things. And so they were upset that they tried to Katrina him. It didn't work.
I think a lot of people would disagree with the fact that they went well, and there were just differences between how they dealt with Puerto Rico and Texas and Florida. And the fact that FEMA has taken off of their website now the number of people still without power in Puerto Rico just looks bad.
Puerto Rico being an island also is a more difficult challenge. By the way, Paul Krugman, the Nobel Prize winning New York Times columnist, had tweeted that there is cholera in Puerto Rico. Heck of a job, Trump, he said. He later said, I got sloppy. I saw cholera, I saw a tweet about cholera from someone I take seriously. I tweeted it out. It was wrong, and I admitted the error. All right, Shannon Pennypiece, Molly Hemingway, Mary Harf, thanks very much for mixing it up today. Ahead, most of the late-night comics turn somber over Las Vegas and line up behind gun control. But up next, the NBC story that prompted Rex Tillerson to deny disparaging the president, who's calling it fake news. But is it? It was an amazing spectacle. Rex Tillerson holding a news conference to knock down an NBC report, quoting sources to say he had to be talked out of quitting as Secretary of State and had privately called the president a moron.
To address a few specifics that have been erroneously reported this morning. The Vice President has never had to persuade me to remain as Secretary of State because I have never considered leaving this post.
The main headline of this story that you called the President a moron, and if not, where do you think these reports or
I'm not going to deal with petty stuff like that.
It was fake news. It was a totally phony story. Thank you very much. It was made up. It was made up by NBC.
If the president were to accept our reporting as true, which it is, he would essentially have to fire Rex Tillerson. I just go back to our reporting. We stand by it. We've extensively reported on this. We talked to a dozen people for this story.
Joining us now is James Rosen, Fox's chief Washington correspondent. And James, the focus in the counterattack on NBC has been whether Tillerson did or didn't make the moron remark. But the more important allegation that he had contemplated quitting has kind of surfaced in news counts before.
It has. This is in Washington journalism. We have a category for this kind of story. It's called palace intrigue, and it's fun and it's gossipy, but it might be cotton candy unless the assertion behind the story, behind the reporting, is that the personality conflict here is so severe that it's impeding the implementation of policy.
That would make it more legitimate news in your view. And Tillerson's spokeswoman later denied that he had made the moron remark, but when he was asked about it, he said, well, as we heard, I'm not going to respond to a petty question.
Which, by the way, had he said it, Had he said it, he still did the right thing in calling it petty and not addressing it. As the French like to say, there are worse things in the world than a little hypocrisy.
New York Times, for example, the next day said his associates have described Tillerson's deep frustration with the president and talk of resignation. So when the president said NBC just made it up, at least there are a couple other news organizations that are saying, no, this is not entirely made up.
What we just heard my very well-respected colleague Carol Lee say is actually not true. If we accept the truth of her reporting, it does not mean that the president has to fire Rex Tillerson. This could have been, the question again is how severe and how persistent is this? And, you know, perhaps an employee or blows off a little steam every now and again. That's not necessarily a reason to fire them.
That's been known to happen, and the president was asked about the relationship over the weekend, said they had a good relationship, but Rex could be a little tougher, which brings me to this, which is the public stage, you know, whatever frictions might exist between these two men. President publicly undercut Tillerson when the Secretary of State went to China, then told reporters there might be some openings for back-channel conversations with North Korea. The President of the United States went on the Twitter and said he'd be wasting his time negotiating with Little Rocket Man and save your energy, Rex.
That's right. So, but then again, Rex Tillerson, we assume to be a pretty astute guy, having run Exxon all those years, and he had a good look at Donald Trump for over a year as a candidate, and then as a nominee, and then as a president-elect, and he knew what he was getting into, I should imagine. And he's not been unique in this regard. Jeff Sessions, various other people, the president, as a manager of talent, seems to think it's okay to conduct this kind of criticism of them in order to incentivize better performance in public. It's not the typical style we see, but it's his style.
Well, President Trump, as you mentioned, repeatedly used Twitter to attack his attorney general as being weak. Some people speculate he was trying to get Sessions to quit. They've apparently patched things up. But that would suggest to me that it is a legitimate subject for journalistic scrutiny, that it's not just gossip, that it's not just palace intrigue, that there are to be, at a minimum, tensions between the President of the United States and some of his key cabinet members.
In fairness to Carol Lee, this has been an unusually contentious White House, riven with, I would say, a greater than usual degree of palace intrigue. I also know what it's like to break a story that's an exclusive and then have the administration say that's fake news. It happened to me a lot during the Obama administration, and that's a lonely place to be when you're all by yourself and you're very sure of your sourcing. So I feel for Carol Lee in that instance. To have the President of the United States coming out and saying that's your story is fake news is strong medicine.
He's entitled to say that, and she's entitled to defend her story on NBC. James Rosen, great to see you. Thanks very much. Coming up, Hollywood mogul Harvey Weinstein plans a leave of absence after the New York Times discloses sexual harassment allegations spanning over 3 decades. So why is he threatening to sue? And later, the network that prematurely buried Tom Petty. Harvey Weinstein is on an indefinite leave of absence from his Hollywood studio after a bombshell New York Times report detailing allegations of sexual harassment that stretched over 3 decades, and the company has ordered up an outside investigation. Actress Ashley Judd says Weinstein, in a meeting in his hotel room, once asked if he could give her a massage or she could watch him shower. One female staffer wrote a memo to executives alleging a toxic environment for women at the company. Weinstein told the Times he is working with therapists. I appreciate the way I've behaved with colleagues in the past. That's caused a lot of pain, he says, and I sincerely apologize for it, though I'm trying to do better. I know I have a long way to go. Lisa Bloom, a lawyer who was advising Weinstein until her resignation yesterday, had said in a statement that he denies many of the accusations as patently false. And the movie mogul told the New York Post that the Times' reporting was reckless, the paper had a vendetta against him, and that he plans to sue. Lead author Jodi Kantor responded on CBS.
Harvey Weinstein, in fact, has called the paper reckless. What do you say to that?
Well, first of all, the story relies on a lot of documentation on the record, names of women, dates of incidents, and remember that one of our sources was internal company records.
Joining us now from New York, Liz Clayman, anchor of After the Closing Bell on the Fox Business Network, and Brent Lang, senior film editor and media editor at Variety. And Brent, New York Times did have 8 interviews with women about harassment allegations, some on the record. One was Ashley Judd, plus an internal company memo. Is this a solidly reported story in your view, and any chance that Weinstein is coming back to this company?
Well, I don't think there's any real thing that they could have done better. It's about as solid as you could get. You have multiple people on the record, you have documentation, you have something of a financial trail. And as I look at it today, I don't see any way that Harvey Weinstein survives this scandal. And frankly, I think the company he founded is in a lot of jeopardy, because I'm not sure there's a Weinstein company without Harvey Weinstein.
Right, it is named after him and run by him and his brother. Liz, this doesn't sound like reckless reporting when you have the subject of the story apologizing, saying he's working with therapists, saying he's going to take a leave. The company says, in effect, he's suspended. What do you think?
Well, I'm not a lawyer, so I spent the last 48 hours calling attorneys from coast to coast, and I can tell you that every single one of them's opinion, they said that it would be absolutely zero chance that Harvey Weinstein would be able to launch a successful offensive suit against the New York Times. I mean, it depends, Howard, what the suit is. If it is, you didn't give me enough time to respond, 48 hours. This is what the New York Times says that it gave the Weinstein company and Harvey to respond. Within that 48 hours, he had already issued a statement saying, I need to work on my anger issues. I'm going to take a leave. I'm working with a therapist. Now, in this day and age, in the Internet, there's an extremely competitive atmosphere with journalists. I know that the Hollywood Reporter's Kim Masters had gotten very close to breaking this story. Only one of her sources had backed away. So the Times knew that they were hot on the trail. To give somebody 48 hours to respond is a huge swath of time.
Let me just put up a statement from the New York Times after I inquired. We included all relevant comments from Mr. Weinstein in our story and published his entire response. Mr. Weinstein and his lawyer have confirmed the essential points of the story. They have not pointed to any errors or challenged any facts in our story. But what I'm wondering, Brent, is I'm reading now from other journalists and insiders that this was sort of an open secret at Weinstein Company and Miramax. There were a lot of talk and rumors about Weinstein's behavior around women. As Liz pointed out, some journalists tried to confirm. But do you think that many journalists were either intimidated or thought it would be too hard to report, or because Harvey Weinstein is a powerful guy in the media and movie and television business?
Well, two things. I think, first of all, it is a very, very difficult story to get. You really can't go forward with allegations this serious unless you have women on the record alleging this, and that's what the Times was able to do that other publications that have been tracking this story for years were not able to do. But you're absolutely right. Harvey Weinstein was a powerhouse. He was also a tyrannical figure, verbally abusive. He is a very scary guy, and I think he scared a number of people off this story before.
Yeah, it sounds like some of the women were very reluctant to come forward. One spoke to the Huffington Post over the weekend, told a very explicit incident. And we've been through this with Bill Cosby, and we've been through this with the two very prominent sexual harassment cases here at Fox News. But Liz, let me ask you, you grew up in Beverly Hills, you know this culture. Did you ever experience harassment and unwanted advances? Does this ring a bell for you?
Well, being in television news, I started in the very late 80s. And by then, I love this dinosaur defense where he had said, well, maybe I'm a dinosaur, or people around him said, this is what the older generation do. I cannot count how many times older anchors or reporters either said something inappropriate to me as a young up-and-coming journalist when I was a production assistant in LA, or they actually grabbed me, kissed me, tried to stick their tongue down my throat. Those are kinds of things where you look at it and say, this anchor, this reporter's a dinosaur. The game entirely changes, Howard, when it is a power play. There is somebody in position to either hire you or completely derail your career. You saw from many of these people in Hollywood, they were very concerned. Ashley Judd on the record saying how, when she was put in a very awful position of being in his hotel room trying to have a meeting, and he was saying, will you give me a massage, watch me take a shower? She said, I kept thinking to myself, how can I get out of this situation without alienating Harvey Weinstein? Which leads to, how did the Times get the story with so much accuracy? There is conjecture, Howard, and I'm sure Brett would agree, that someone within the Weinstein organization gave them this because they knew, and that, of course, leads to the board. Were they complicit? That's a problem, too.
Yeah, or at least
Weinstein wants Harvey out of the company. I mean, I'm pretty confident that he is pushing to have his brother leave the company.
Brent,
and I don't know if he helped with this story.
We don't know,
you're
so
right.
let's not speculate. Let's not speculate. But Brent, let me jump in here about the coverage, because there's been a few cable segments on this on each of the cable news channels. There's very little on NBC. And the question is, you know, since when conservatives have gotten this kind of trouble, it's been a very big story. We do have a situation where Harvey Weinstein gave hundreds of thousands of dollars to Democrats, held fundraisers for Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama. Former President Obama's daughter worked there as an intern. Do you think there'd be as much media outrage if, let's say, Harvey Weinstein was a big Trump donor?
Well, I think it's actually disgraceful that more people haven't come forward and condemned this, because this kind of behavior is completely unacceptable, and the era of the casting couch needs to be put to an end. And I think you're absolutely right that there is still a somewhat tribal mentality in Hollywood where people do view him as one of their own. They feel that he has made contributions to the art of cinema, and there is a wariness, and there is still some fear that that if you speak out too publicly, your career could be derailed.
Liz Clayman, I've got 20 seconds for a final thought.
My final thought is that he has no case, according to people in the know. The truth will out, as Shakespeare said, and it is coming out. Huffington Post, Yashir Ali has a piece with a Fox reporter from local L.A. who described the most disgusting situation that she endured with Harvey Weinstein, and this was years ago. Why didn't she speak up? You know, she was in television news. She didn't have to worry about him, but there are legions of businesses that depend on Harvey Weinstein, whether it's the book industry or concerts or whatever. It's not a defense to say, oh, I've given money to women's causes. That's kind of a backup, and it's kind of a cover story.
This story is not over. Liz Clayman, Brent Lang, thanks very much for joining us this Sunday. Ahead, one firing and one retraction. A very rough week for CBS. But first, Jimmy Kimmel, Stephen Colbert, Seth Meyers, and others pushing gun control. Is that what their audiences want? Late-night comics seem to do a lot less comedy these days. Most of them spoke out passionately after the mass shooting in Las Vegas, while also criticizing the Republicans and calling for gun control.
I don't know why our so-called leaders continue to allow this to happen, or maybe a better question, why do we continue to let them to allow it to happen? They should be praying. They should be praying for God to forgive them for letting the gun lobby run this country.
Instead of saying, this isn't the time to talk about it, just say, we're never going to talk about it. If it's going to be thoughts and prayers from here on out, the least you can do is be honest about that.
Joining us now from New York is Shelby Holliday, senior video reporter for the Wall Street Journal. Now, look, the comics were not going to come out and tell a lot of jokes after this horrifying incident, especially Jimmy Kimmel, whose hometown is Las Vegas. But were you surprised at the vehemence in which many of them called for greater gun restrictions?
Yes and no. I would say overwhelmingly I wasn't surprised, because the more these late-night hosts get political, the better they do. And we've seen them get political with regards to health care. They've criticized the president more than they've criticized or joked about any other president. That's according to research from George Mason University. So getting political is actually good for them. Jimmy Kimmel gave that very emotional monologue. He is from Las Vegas. He blasted Republican senators for not acting on gun control. Stephen Colbert said Congress should do literally anything and they'll be heroes. He talked about universal background checks, preventing mentally ill from getting guns. A lot of these guys called for action without having all of the facts of the shooting. Now, their critics would say that's a bad idea. We need to learn what was behind the shooting, what the motive was, how this guy got the guns. The late night show hosts didn't care, and they moved forward, called for action, and faced a lot of criticism because of it as well.
So if I were to say, what happened to the concept that people just want to be entertained 11:30 at night, you would say, look, especially Colbert, whose show is now #1, he's the fiercest Trump critic among them, that this resonates with their audience, but there's also the part of the audience that supports President Trump, which I would think might be alienated.
It's true, and so we did see some of the late night, and even Ellen, she's not on late night, but she is a comedian, and they came out, she and Jimmy Fallon, and their message was to remind people there is more good in the world than there is evil. Ellen did a lovely segment playing clips of all these people she paid tribute to who do good. We did see Jimmy Fallon have Miley Cyrus on to sing a beautiful tribute song. So some of these late night show hosts didn't get very political, but if you look at ratings and if you look at audience numbers, the political show hosts do better when they criticize the president and when they get political.
Since you mentioned Jimmy Fallon, whose Tonight Show I would say is the most apolitical of the late night offerings, he interviewed Hillary Clinton, and you mentioned Miley Cyrus is on She, and every female writer on the Tonight Show came out and offered gushing praise of the former First Lady. Let's take a look at that.
Thank you, Hillary Clinton, for being someone I continue to admire and look up to, and for standing up to critics who said that a woman couldn't be president because they'd be too emotional, impulsive, and unpredictable. So glad we didn't end up with someone like that.
Can I give you a hug?
Yes!
So this went on for 6 minutes. Can you imagine a defeated Republican candidate getting that kind of love fest?
No, I can't. But this year is a very different year for comedy, so I guess anything can happen. I would say that you know, these late night comedians have said this week it's really hard to entertain when you have mass shootings, the biggest mass shooting in history.
Right.
And so I think they're all just trying different ways to deal with it. That was an interesting angle, certainly.
Right. All right.
No, it's hard to imagine this happening any other year.
It is basically impossible to imagine. All right. President Trump not pleased. He went on Twitter and said late night hosts are dealing with the Democrats for their very unfunny and repetitive material, always anti-Trump. Should we get equal time? It's kind of interesting to hear a president of the United States saying, who's on TV all the time, he should get equal time.
Right. Right. Donald Trump's basically saying he's not on television enough. It goes both ways here. There's an FCC rule that basically says when candidates are running for office, they deserve equal time. When you're the president, that doesn't really apply. But President Trump is making a point that he wants to be treated fairly. He always wants to be treated fairly by the media.
Jimmy
Shocker,
Kimmel's
right
response, quit your job and you can have my show. Shelby Holliday, thanks very much for joining us from New York.
Thank you.
And after the break, some posts on Facebook and Google identify the wrong Las Vegas shooter. Why can't these tech giants crack down on bogus news?